I moved back to my grandmother's house in the middle of nowhere with my 6-year-old daughter, Hannah, after my divorce. The decision wasn't made lightly. I'd spent weeks agonizing over our options, but with mounting bills and a salary that barely covered our basic needs, the choice was ultimately made for us. The house wasn't ideal. Its aged wooden beams groaned under the weight of decades, and the surrounding forest pressed against the windows like a wall of darkness. But it was free, and I desperately needed to escape the suffocating city with its constant reminders of my failed marriage. My grandmother had passed away the year before, leaving the house to me in her will. A final act of kindness from a woman who had always understood the importance of having a safe harbor in life's storms. I'd visited often as a child, but I'd forgotten how isolated it felt, perched on the edge of civilization like a forgotten sentinel. The nearest neighbor was a 20-minute walk down a winding dirt path, their lights barely visible through the dense canopy of trees. "Look, Hannah," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice as I wrestled with the old brass key in the lock. The mechanism protested with a screech that seemed to echo through the silent forest. "This is where we're going to live now. Isn't it cozy?" The word cozy felt hollow in my mouth, a desperate attempt to paint our situation in warmer colors. Hannah didn't reply. She stood on the threshold, her small frame rigid with tension, staring past me into the shadowy interior. The evening light filtered through the dusty windows, casting strange patterns on the wooden floors. I looked down at her and smiled, though a shiver ran up my spine at her solemn expression. Her eyes, usually bright with childish curiosity, seemed older somehow, more knowing. "It's spooky," she finally said, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit closer to her chest. The toy, a constant companion since her father left, seemed to stare at the house with the same wariness as its owner. "It's not spooky," I said firmly, pushing aside my own misgivings. "It's just old. Everything old has character. That's what makes it special." The words sounded unconvincing, even to my ears. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of making an abandoned house livable again. I spent most of my time cleaning and airing out the musty rooms, attacking decades of dust with determined vigor. The physical labor helped keep my mind off the unsettling silence that seemed to press against the windows at night. While I worked, Hannah explored the house, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms like gentle thunder. She especially loved the main tatami room, with its sliding shoji doors that whispered across their tracks, and the little alcove where my grandmother used to display her immaculate flower arrangements. Sometimes I'd find her sitting there for hours, talking quietly to her rabbit, as sunlight filtered through the rice paper doors, casting her small form in a gentle glow. But there was something about the way she'd stare at the floor that made my skin crawl. At night, though, I started noticing small things, the way the wind seemed to moan through the cracks in the windows, carrying whispers that almost sounded like words. The house creaked and settled in the darkness, the sounds too rhythmic to be random, as though someone were walking through it with careful, deliberate steps. I told myself it was just the natural sounds of an old house, but the explanations felt increasingly hollow as the days wore on. One night, I woke suddenly, my heart pounding, without knowing why. The moonlight painted silver squares on my bedroom floor, and in them stood Hannah, her white nightgown ghostly in the pale light. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, its button eyes gleaming unnaturally in the darkness. "What is it, sweetie?" I asked groggily, trying to shake off the disorientation of sudden wakefulness. The digital clock on my nightstand cast a red glow that seemed to pulse like a warning. "There's someone under the floor," she whispered, her voice carrying an odd resonance that made my skin prickle. Her eyes, usually warm brown like mine, seemed almost black in the darkness. I stared at her, my heart skipping a beat. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, as though the darkness had substance. "What do you mean?" "I hear them talking," she said, her small fingers working nervously at the rabbit's worn ear. They're saying my name, over and over. They know I'm listening. I took her back to her room, my bare feet silent against the cold wooden floors. Every step felt wrong somehow, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I tucked her in, pulling the covers up to her chin and telling her it was just her imagination. The same way my mother had once comforted me about monsters under the bed. But as I left, I thought I heard a faint, distant whisper coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. I told myself it was the wind, but even then, I knew I was lying. Over the next week, the whispers grew more frequent, more insistent. I began hearing them too, faint but distinct, usually in the deepest part of night when the world felt thin and unreal. They seemed to emanate from the tatami room, sometimes as quiet murmuring, other times like a soft, persistent tapping that followed the rhythm of a heartbeat. The sound would stop abruptly when I entered the room, leaving behind a silence that felt accusatory. One afternoon, while the sun still held the shadows at bay, I lifted the edge of one tatami mat, expecting, hoping, to find evidence of mice or some other mundane explanation. Instead, I found nothing but the wooden boards underneath, their surface scratched with marks that looked unsettlingly like fingernails had made them. That's when I remembered the crawl space. The memory surfaced like a bubble in dark water. My grandmother, her face stern with unusual severity, warning me never to go down there. She'd said it was dangerous, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't understood as a child. I'd never given it much thought then, but now, with the whispers growing louder each night, curiosity and unease gnawed at me like hungry rats. One afternoon, while Hannah was napping upstairs, her soft breathing a counterpoint to the house's hollow silence, I found the access hatch. It was tucked behind a heavy cabinet in the kitchen, the wood around it darker than the surrounding floor, as though stained by something other than age. The wood was warped with time and secrets, and I had to pry it open with a crowbar. Each crack of splintering wood echoed through the house like gunshots. A foul smell wafted up from the darkness below, earthy and stale, carrying undertones of something worse, something that made my hindbrain scream of death and decay. My hands trembled as I grabbed a flashlight, its beam seeming weak against the absolute darkness below. The ladder creaked ominously as I lowered myself down, each rung feeling less stable than the last. The crawlspace was cramped, the ceiling pressing down like a physical weight. The air was thick and suffocating, tasting of mold and forgotten things. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing generations of cobwebs, old pipes that leaked quiet drops of water, and something glinting in the far corner, catching the light like an animal's eye. I crawled toward it, the packed earth cold and damp beneath my hands. In the corner, half buried in decades of dust, sat a rusted tin box. Its surface was corroded with age, but I could still make out faint traces of elaborate patterns etched into the metal. They reminded me of the protective wards I'd sometimes seen at temples, though these seemed somehow wrong, as though drawn by a shaking hand. Inside the box was a diary, its leather cover cracked and faded like ancient skin. The pages smelled of mildew and secrets, and they crackled beneath my fingers like dead leaves. The handwriting inside was my grandmother's, though different from how I remembered it, more urgent, less controlled, as though written in haste or fear. That night, after putting Hannah to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and began reading. The weak light from my lamp created a small circle of illumination, beyond which the shadows seemed to gather and watch. The entries started innocuously enough, describing her daily life with the kind of mundane detail common to such journals. The changing seasons, visits from family, recipes she wanted to remember. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The entries became more fragmented, erratic, the handwriting increasingly unsteady. January 15th, 1956. There is something in the forest. I hear it at night, scratching at the walls. The sound follows the rhythm of my heartbeat. The elders say I'm imagining things, but I see the fear in their eyes when I mention it. They know something they won't tell me. February 2nd, 1956. I saw him again. A man, pale as death, standing among the trees at twilight. His clothes are all wrong, too old, too formal for these mountains. When I called out, he disappeared, but the air where he stood remained cold for hours afterward. The vegetables in my garden have begun to rot from the inside. March 10th, 1956. They want him gone. The elders finally told me the truth about the disappearances 50 years ago, about the foreigner who came to study our customs and never left. They say the only way to end it is to seal him below. I am afraid. The ritual they described. Such things shouldn't exist in this modern age. But the scratching is getting louder, and yesterday I found bloody handprints on the inside of my windows. The final entry sent chills through me, the words barely legible, as though written with a shaking hand. March 15th, 1956. It is done. The whispers have stopped, but I can still feel his eyes on me. Will it ever truly be over? The elders say we must never speak of this again, must let the years bury our sins like autumn leaves. But some things refuse to stay buried. I hear him sometimes, in the spaces between heartbeats, waiting, watching. The house remembers what we did, and houses have long memories. That night, I dreamed of the pale man. He stood in the corner of the tatami room, his hollow eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt physical. His clothes were indeed old, a Western suit from another century, now stained with earth and darker things. When I tried to scream, no sound came. When I woke, drenched in cold sweat, I found Hannah standing at the foot of my bed again. Her stuffed rabbit dangled from her hand, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. "He's angry," she said, her voice carrying echoes of other voices, older and filled with hunger. "He says you shouldn't have opened the box. Some things are supposed to stay buried." I pulled her into bed with me, holding her close as my mind raced through the implications of what I'd discovered. Her small body felt too cold, and her heartbeat seemed to echo the tapping I'd heard beneath the floors. What had my grandmother done? Who was the man she wrote about? And why did Hannah seem to know so much about him? The questions chased each other through my mind, like autumn leaves in a storm. The next morning, I decided to confront the whispers head-on. While Hannah played in the backyard, I could see her through the window, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with her rabbit. I returned to the tatami room. The air felt thicker here, heavy with anticipation. Using a crowbar, I pried up the mats, one by one, until the entire floor was exposed. The wood underneath was darker than it should have been, stained with old secrets. Beneath the wooden boards, I found another layer of old, rotting planks. They were covered in more of the strange symbols I'd seen on the tin box, carved deep into the wood and filled with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. My hands trembled as I worked to remove them, each board coming free with a sound like a moan. What I uncovered made my blood run cold. Beneath the boards was a shallow grave, lined with more protective symbols and filled with bones that seemed to gleam with their own pale light. They lay tangled in a haphazard heap, suggesting a violent death or hasty burial. A skull stared up at me, its jaw agape as if frozen mid-scream. I could see marks on the bone, deep grooves that spoke of a death more violent than anything I'd imagined. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My grandmother's diary fell from my pocket, landing open on the ground. The pages fluttered in a wind I couldn't feel, settling on the final entry. But there was something new, something I hadn't seen before. Scrawled in the margins, in handwriting that wasn't my grandmother's, were the words, "He is watching. He will not rest. The price must be paid in full. That night, the whispers turned into screams. They started as the sun set, rising in pitch and intensity until the very air seemed to vibrate with them. Hannah clung to me, sobbing, as the house seemed to come alive with noise. The walls groaned like living things, the windows rattled in their frames, and beneath it all, the man's voice rose, a guttural, bone-chilling howl that spoke of decades of pain and rage. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear and desperation. The family photos on the walls began to slide sideways, their glass cracking in patterns that looked like frozen screams. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my eardrums like cotton wool. In that silence, I could hear Hannah's breathing. Too slow, too regular for a frightened child. "You must finish it," she whispered, her voice strange and distant, carrying echoes of other voices, older and filled with ancient knowledge. She looked at me with eyes that weren't her own. They were darker, deeper, holding memories of things that should have stayed buried. "You must put him to rest. The ritual was incomplete. The price was only half paid." I spent the rest of the night researching purification rituals, poring over websites and old books I found in my grandmother's study. The next day, I gathered everything I needed: salt, blessed by a Shinto priest, incense made from sacred woods, and white candles that smelled faintly of grave soil. Hannah helped me, her demeanor eerily calm, moving with a purpose that seemed beyond her years. That evening, we returned to the tatami room. The setting sun painted the walls blood red, and shadows gathered in the corners, like watching crowds. I set the bones carefully in the center of the room, arranging them in the proper position for a peaceful rest. The skull seemed to watch me as I worked, its empty sockets holding something that might have been gratitude. I began the ritual, chanting prayers that felt ancient on my tongue. The words came naturally, as though someone else were speaking through me. I spread salt in a protective circle, the white crystals glowing softly in the gathering darkness. The incense smoke writhed in patterns that looked almost like words. The air grew heavy, pressing down like a physical weight, and the room seemed to darken beyond the natural fall of night. Shadows danced on the walls, coalescing into the shape of a man. He stood at the edge of the circle, his pale face twisted in an anguish that spoke of decades of unquiet rest. His eyes, when they met mine, held no malice, only a bone-deep weariness and a longing for peace. "Leave us," I said, my voice trembling, but carrying an authority that came from somewhere beyond myself. "Go to your rest. Your time here is done." For a moment, the shadow hesitated. The air grew colder, and I could feel him testing the boundaries of the circle, seeking weakness. Then, with a sound like a long-held sigh, he dissolved into the darkness. The air lightened suddenly, and the room fell silent. For the first time since we arrived, the house felt still, as though it too could finally rest. The next morning, I buried the bones in the forest, far from the house. Hannah and I worked together under the weak winter sun, neither of us speaking. The earth seemed to accept the bones eagerly, as though grateful to have them returned. When it was done, I whispered a quiet apology. To the man, to my grandmother, to the land itself that had held these secrets for so long. That night, the house was quiet. No whispers, no creaks, just the peaceful silence of a place finally at rest. As I tucked Hannah into bed, she smiled up at me, her own smile now, free of the strange knowledge that had filled her these past weeks. "He's gone now," she said, hugging her rabbit close. "You made him." I've been a tour guide at Daikakuji Temple in Kyoto for 5 years, leading countless visitors through its ancient halls and meticulously maintained gardens. It's an unremarkable job most days, guiding groups past weathered stone lanterns, explaining the temple's centuries-old history and gently reminding eager tourists not to climb on the moss-covered statues of guardian deities that stand sentinel at every corner. The work has fallen into such a comfortable routine that I can recite the temple's founding date and architectural details in my sleep. But there's one thing about this place that always stood out to me, even before I truly noticed it. A lantern in the temple courtyard that never dims. It's an old paper lantern, its wooden frame darkened and gnarled with age, hanging precariously from the weathered eaves of the prayer hall. The paper itself has turned the color of old bone, its surface marked with countless tiny creases like an ancient map. During the day, it's almost invisible among the brighter, newer lanterns that line the courtyard, their pristine white paper and gleaming frames drawing all attention. But at night, when the rest of the courtyard is shrouded in shadow and the tour groups have long since departed, this particular lantern glows with an otherworldly luminescence, even when there's no light source within its dusty confines. I used to rationalize it away, convincing myself it was some trick of the moonlight filtering through the temple's ancient cedar trees, or perhaps a reflection from the modern street lamps that line the narrow roads outside the temple grounds. That was before I realized the terrifying truth. No one else could see it. One evening, as I was performing my final duties of locking up the prayer hall, I found myself lingering in the courtyard, transfixed by the lantern. The soft, ethereal glow seemed more pronounced than usual in the gathering darkness, pulsing ever so slightly, like a dying heartbeat. The autumn air was crisp and still, carrying the faint scent of incense from the day's ceremonies. I turned to my coworker, Ayumi, who was methodically stacking meditation cushions nearby, her movements careful and practiced after years of the same routine. "Doesn't that lantern look strange to you?" I asked, pointing to where it hung in the shadows. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the empty courtyard, as if the very stones beneath our feet were listening. She paused in her work, squinting in the direction I indicated, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Which one?" "The old one, the one that's glowing right now." I tried to keep my voice steady, though my heart had begun to race. She frowned, her eyes scanning the spot where the lantern hung, looking straight through it as if it were invisible. "It's not glowing. It's just an empty frame. Has been for years. Are you okay? You've been working too many evening shifts lately." Her words sent an icy chill through my body, as if someone had poured frozen water down my spine. I didn't press the issue further, not wanting to seem unstable. As the weeks passed, I tried my best to ignore the lantern, to focus on my tours and administrative duties, but its glow seemed to grow brighter with each passing night, as if it were calling to me with increasing urgency. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I could swear I saw it swaying gently, though there was never any wind in the sheltered courtyard. The situation took a darker, more unsettling turn when I started having dreams about it. These weren't ordinary dreams. They had a visceral quality that left me feeling as if I'd actually lived through them. In these nightly visions, I would find myself standing alone in the temple courtyard, the air thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even my breathing. The stone path beneath my feet would feel unnaturally cold, even through my shoes, and the familiar surroundings would be transformed into something alien and threatening by the darkness. I would always end up staring up at the lantern as it swayed in a non-existent breeze, its glow casting impossible shadows that seemed to writhe and dance across the ancient walls. Then, without fail, a figure would emerge from the deepest shadows, always the same, a man wearing a tattered priest's robe that seemed to float around him as if he were underwater. His face remained obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, typical of traditional Buddhist clergy. But somehow I knew that if I could see beneath it, I would find something that would shatter my sanity. He would raise one skeletal hand, pointing to the lantern with deliberate slowness, and whisper, in a voice that seemed to echo from the bottom of a well, Bring light to the forsaken. Then I'd wake up, my bed sheets soaked with cold sweat, those words echoing in my mind like a funeral bell. The dreams became a nightly torment, each one more vivid than the last. During my waking hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lantern wanted something from me, needed something from me. Dark circles formed under my eyes, as sleep became increasingly elusive. My co-workers noticed the change in me, their concerned glances following me as I moved through my daily routines like a ghost myself. Finally, driven to the edge of madness by the relentless dreams and the lantern's constant presence in my thoughts, I decided to investigate. After my shift one evening, I stayed behind, waiting in the shadows until the temple grounds emptied of the last visitors and staff members. I brought a heavy-duty flashlight and a sturdy aluminum ladder, determined to examine the mysterious lantern up close. When I finally reached it, my hands trembling slightly as I balanced on the ladder's highest step, I saw that the paper was riddled with countless tiny holes, as if generations of moths had feasted upon it. The wooden frame was warped and fragile-looking, bearing the scars of countless seasons of rain and sun. As my fingers brushed against its surface, a jolt of energy ran through my body like an electric current, and the lantern's glow intensified dramatically, bathing the courtyard in an unnatural light. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance on the ladder. That's when I noticed something etched into the darkened wood of the frame. An inscription in ancient kanji, the characters worn but still legible. For the eyes that watch in darkness. The inscription haunted me, worming its way into my thoughts during every waking moment. I spent countless hours researching it, poring over dusty temple records and local legends in the archives. My searches led me through centuries of temple history, through tales of tragedy and triumph, until finally I discovered the truth about the lantern. Known as the Lantern of the Forsaken, it marked the site where a disgraced priest had been buried alive centuries ago during the temple's darkest period. According to the records, he had been accused of breaking his sacred vows and bringing shame to the temple, though the exact nature of his transgression was lost to time. As punishment, he had been entombed beneath the courtyard stones, condemned to spend his last moments in absolute darkness. Local folklore claimed his spirit still lingered in the temple grounds, eternally seeking redemption, but never finding peace. The story disturbed me deeply, but it also explained the recurring dreams that had been plaguing my nights. I felt a strange, almost overwhelming compulsion to fulfill the priest's whispered plea. "Bring light to the forsaken," he had said in my dreams. The words had seemed cryptic before, but now they carried a weight of purpose. But what exactly did they mean? What was I supposed to do? A few nights later, driven by an intuition I couldn't explain, I returned to the courtyard with a bundle of pure white candles and a silver lighter that had belonged to my grandfather. The air was unusually still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It felt absurd, standing there in the darkness with my arms full of candles, but I had to try something. With methodical care, I placed the candles in a perfect circle beneath the lantern, lighting them one by one while whispering a prayer with each flame. The candlelight flickered in the night air, casting strange dancing shadows on the prayer hall's ancient walls. For a long moment, nothing happened. The candles burned steadily, their flames perfectly still in the windless night. Then, without warning, the ground beneath the lantern began to tremble, sending vibrations through the stone path beneath my feet. I stepped back instinctively as the earth cracked open with a sound like breaking bones, revealing a narrow pit that seemed to descend into infinite darkness. A foul odor wafted up from the depths, the smell of centuries-old decay and stagnant air, and I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness of the pit, I could make out a wooden box resting at the bottom, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust, and etched with the same mysterious kanji that marked the lantern's frame. My hands trembled uncontrollably, as I reached down to pry open the box, its ancient wood creaking in protest. Inside lay a set of prayer beads, their surface stained dark with what I hoped was age, and a small scroll that seemed impossibly well preserved. I unrolled the scroll with trembling fingers, handling it as carefully as if it were made of spun glass. The text was faded but legible, written in an archaic form of Japanese that took me several minutes to decipher. What I read made my blood run cold. It was a confession, a desperate plea for forgiveness from the disgraced priest. But it wasn't what I had expected. He had been wrongly accused, framed by a jealous rival who had coveted his position within the temple hierarchy. The scroll ended with a chilling curse. "Let those who condemned me know eternal darkness." As I finished reading the final characters, the lantern's usual soft glow suddenly intensified into a blinding radiance that filled the entire courtyard. I threw up my arm to shield my eyes, feeling waves of heat washing over me like a fever. When I finally lowered my arm, the figure from my dreams stood before me, more solid and real than he had ever appeared before. His wide-brimmed hat still obscured his features, but I could feel his gaze boring into me with an intensity that made my soul shrivel. "You have brought light to the truth," he said, his voice resonating like a temple bell struck at midnight. "Now you must carry it." Before I could react or respond, the prayer beads suddenly animated, flying from the box as if pulled by invisible strings. They wrapped themselves around my wrist with surprising force, forming a shackle of wooden beads that felt unnaturally warm against my skin. The figure raised one hand in a gesture that seemed both blessing and curse, and the ground sealed itself with a grinding of stone on stone, erasing all evidence of the pit and its secrets. The lantern's brilliant glow subsided, returning to its usual faint, ethereal luminescence. Since that fateful night, I felt the weight of the beads constantly, as if they're more than just physical objects, as if they're a chain binding me to something vast and ancient. I've started seeing things that shouldn't be there, shadows that move against the flow of light, faces peering from the corners of empty rooms, figures that vanish when looked at directly, and the dreams have changed in nature. The priest no longer appears to me with his haunting command. Instead, I see the temple as it existed centuries ago, its halls alive with the bustling activity of monks and worshippers in historical dress. In these visions, I feel his presence beside me, guiding me through the memories of a time long past. I've come to understand my role in this ancient drama. The lantern is no longer just a curious anomaly. It's a beacon between worlds, a bridge spanning the gulf between the living and the dead. My task, I've realized, is to ensure that the truth of the forsaken priest's story is never forgotten, to bear witness to an injustice centuries old. It's a burden I never asked for, but one I've found impossible to escape. Sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I wonder if I was chosen for this role, long before I ever set foot in Daikakuji Temple. The lantern still hangs in its place in the courtyard, its mysterious glow as steady and unchanging as the day I first noticed it. Tourists walk beneath it every day, snapping photos and chattering excitedly, completely oblivious to its profound significance. Only I can see its light for what it truly is, not just a supernatural phenomenon, but a reminder of the darkness that lingers in the shadows of history and the eternal human need for truth and redemption. Some nights, when I'm alone in the courtyard and the moon is hidden behind clouds, I swear I can hear whispered thanks carried on the wind, and the prayer beads around my wrist grow warm with an inner light that matches the lantern's eternal glow. I never should have gone into those woods. The thought haunts me now, repeating endlessly in my mind like a broken record, each iteration carrying the weight of my foolishness. But hindsight, as they say, is perfect, and my ambition was anything but. It started with an innocent enough intention: research. I was working on my thesis in anthropology, focusing on remote Japanese shrines and their ties to local folklore. The subject had fascinated me since my undergraduate years, when I'd first learned about the intricate web of beliefs that connected rural communities to their sacred spaces. When I learned about a forgotten shrine in a rural village called Yukimura, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The shrine had no official records, no documentation, just vague stories from villagers about the threads. For an ambitious doctoral candidate, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to make my mark in the field. The village itself was a 3-hour train ride from Tokyo, followed by a winding bus journey through mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. When I arrived, the late autumn air was crisp and heavy, with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Yukimura was everything I'd hoped for, a place where time moved differently, where old traditions still held sway. "You'll want to leave that one alone," one elderly man warned me in the village square, his weathered face creasing with concern as he gripped his walking stick tighter. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but sharp with awareness, fixed on me with unsettling intensity. "People don't come back the same. The threads, they change you." He shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. His words only deepened my curiosity, adding fuel to the academic fire that burned within me. Yukimura was picturesque, a quaint village nestled in the shadow of a sprawling forest that seemed to stretch endlessly into the misty distance. The houses were traditional, their wooden frames darkened with age, their tile roofs hosting clusters of moss that glowed emerald in the diffuse light. I'd come prepared with maps, notebooks, and my camera, a professional DSLR that had captured countless other shrines across Japan. My professor had even lent me an old guidebook, its pages yellow and brittle with age, that mentioned the shrine in passing, referring to it as the Shrine of the Black Threads. The book said little else, only that it was dedicated to a minor deity whose name had been lost to time. But the villagers' fear, and the lack of concrete history, made it irresistible. The academic in me saw it as a golden opportunity, a chance to uncover something truly unique. That's how all the best discoveries start, right? I couldn't have been more wrong. I ventured into the woods early in the morning, when the sun was just beginning to pierce the morning mist. The air was thick with moisture, and each breath felt heavy in my lungs. I followed a path that quickly became overgrown, its stones cracked and displaced by persistent roots that snaked across the ground like petrified serpents. The deeper I went, the darker it became, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to block out the sunlight. Their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy so dense that only occasional shafts of light penetrated, dancing with dust motes in the gloom. I marked my route with bright orange ribbons, tying them to branches every few meters. It was a habit I'd picked up from my fieldwork in similar places, though something about these woods made me tie them more frequently than usual. The silence was oppressive. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of my own footsteps crushing dead leaves and the occasional creak of ancient trees. About an hour in, I found it. The transition was sudden. One moment I was pushing through thick underbrush. The next I stood at the edge of a clearing that seemed to absorb what little light reached the forest floor. The shrine was smaller than I'd imagined, more a collection of crumbling stones than a structure. A torii gate stood lopsided at the entrance, its wood blackened and slick with moss that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The gate's crossbeam was warped, twisting like a grimace against the forest backdrop. Stone lanterns lined the pathway, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns of vines and twisting shapes that seemed to shift when viewed too long. At the center was the altar, a squat, rectangular block of stone that bore the scars of countless seasons. But what caught my attention most were the threads. Long black filaments hung from the torii gate, the trees, even the stones. They weren't cobwebs. They were too thick, too purposeful in their placement. They swayed slightly, though there was no wind, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a language I couldn't quite read. I approached one and reached out to touch it, my academic curiosity overriding my instinctive revulsion. It felt rough and sticky, like a cobweb mixed with tar, with an unnatural warmth that seemed to pulse against my skin. When I pulled my hand away, a thin black smear remained on my fingertips, and for a moment, I could have sworn it moved on its own. I set up my camera and began documenting the sight, trying to maintain professional detachment despite the growing unease in my gut. The shrine felt ancient, forgotten by time, yet somehow alert, aware. The black threads were everywhere, coiling and weaving through the branches above, like dark arteries in a petrified circulatory system. My camera's flash illuminated them strangely. Instead of reflecting light, they seemed to absorb it, creating void-like spaces in my photographs. I noticed something strange as I moved around. The threads always seemed to be in my peripheral vision, shifting subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. They appeared to reach toward me, then retreat when I turned my head. It's just a trick of the light, I told myself. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with each click of the camera shutter. That's when I found the offering box. It was buried beneath a thick layer of the threads, its wooden surface warped and cracked like ancient skin. The threads seemed particularly dense here, as if guarding something. When I carefully brushed them aside, they clung to my fingers, resistant to being moved. Inside were coins, long rusted, their surfaces corroded into unrecognizable shapes, and teeth. Human teeth, polished and gleaming as if freshly cleaned, arranged in neat rows like horrible pearls. My stomach turned, but I took a picture, documenting the find with shaking hands. Some of the teeth had gold fillings that caught the light of my camera flash, winking at me like knowing eyes. As I packed up my equipment, I felt a sudden, sharp sting on the back of my neck, like an ice-cold needle piercing my skin. Swatting at it, I pulled my hand away to find another black thread stuck to my skin. Unlike the others, this one was moving, writhing like a tiny worm, its movements deliberate and purposeful. As I watched, horrified, it disintegrated into ash, leaving behind a small, dark mark like a birthmark I'd never had before. That night, back in the village, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of the teeth, the strange movements of the threads, the way they seemed to reach for me when I wasn't looking. The mark on my neck throbbed dully, a constant reminder of what I'd encountered. The villagers avoided me when I returned, their eyes darting away as if they knew where I'd been, as if I carried some visible taint. One old woman muttered something under her breath as I passed, a prayer perhaps, or a ward against evil. My small room at the local inn felt different too. The shadows seemed deeper, more active, and the corners of the room appeared to stretch away into impossible distances. The mirror above the sink showed only my reflection, but something about it seemed wrong, as if my movements were slightly out of sync with what I saw. I thought about leaving Yukimura altogether. My rational mind screamed at me to pack my bags and catch the next bus out of the village, but the academic in me wouldn't let it go. I had to know more. I spent the next day researching, speaking to the few villagers willing to talk. They told me stories, half whispers, half warnings, about the shrine, each account adding another layer to the horror I'd witnessed. The threads come for those who disturb it, one man said, his voice low as we sat in the village's only cafe. His hands trembled as he lifted his teacup, spilling drops onto the worn wooden table. They mark you, and they bind you to it. It's how the shrine feeds. What happens if you're bound? I asked, dreading the answer but unable to stop myself. He didn't answer. He just looked at me with pity, his eyes lingering on the mark on my neck that had begun to spread, sending tiny black tendrils across my skin like cracks in ice. The threads followed me home. I first noticed them that night, as I sat at my desk reviewing my photographs. A single strand, dangling from the corner of my ceiling, swaying slightly despite the still air. When I tried to grab it, it vanished like smoke, but I could still feel its phantom touch on my fingers. But more appeared, always at the edges of my vision, curling around my bed frame, weaving through my desk lamp, stretching toward me like hungry fingers. The photographs revealed nothing. Where I knew I'd captured images of the threads, there were only strange dark smudges, as if something had interfered with the camera's sensor. The offering box appeared empty in the pictures, though I knew what I'd seen inside it. I started having nightmares. In them, I was back at the shrine, surrounded by the threads. They wrapped around my arms, my legs, my throat, pulling me down into the earth. The ground beneath me wasn't soil but teeth, thousands of them, clicking and chattering as I sank deeper. I'd wake up gasping, my throat raw as if I'd been screaming, only to see the faint glint of black threads in the moonlight, retreating into the shadows as consciousness returned. My body began to change. Thin black marks appeared on my skin, winding up my arms like tattoos, following the paths of my veins but somehow wrong, as if my blood had been replaced with something darker. They burned sometimes, sharp and searing, as if the threads were burrowing deeper into my flesh. I tried to scrub them off in scalding showers, but they wouldn't fade. Instead, they seemed to darken, spreading further with each passing day. Desperation drove me back to the shrine. I needed to undo whatever I'd done, to break the connection that I could feel growing stronger with each passing hour. This time, the path seemed shorter, almost as if the forest wanted me to return. My orange ribbons were gone, replaced by thin black threads that seemed to point the way. The threads were thicker now, spilling across the ground like a carpet of writhing shadows. They clung to my legs as I walked, pulling me forward with gentle but insistent pressure. When I reached the altar, the black threads coiled together, moving with purpose and terrible grace. They formed a shape, a figure that emerged from the mass like a swimmer surfacing from dark water. It was humanoid, but its body was composed entirely of the threads, writhing and shifting like a living tapestry. Its face was featureless, save for two hollow sockets where eyes should have been, voids that seemed to pull at my vision, threatening to draw me in. "You disturbed my rest," it said, though its face remained still. The voice was low and resonant, vibrating through my chest like the hum of an enormous bell. Each word seemed to echo in my bones, in the spaces between my thoughts. "You must pay the price." "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice trembling. The marks on my skin burned in response to its presence. "I didn't know. Please, I'll leave. I'll never come back." The figure tilted its head, as if considering me. The movement was too smooth, too fluid to be natural. "Return what was taken." It raised an arm, and the threads surged toward me like a wave of living darkness. They wrapped around my wrists with impossible strength, pulling me to my knees. My bag spilled open, and the offerings I'd taken fell out. Coins, their rust now looking suspiciously like dried blood. A shard of wood from the Torah gate that I'd pocketed without thinking. A small black bead I hadn't even realized I'd taken, which pulsed with a dull light like a dying star. The threads recoiled, snapping toward the items and pulling them back to the altar with the speed of striking snakes. As they touched the stone, each item seemed to dissolve, becoming one with the writhing mass of black filaments. The figure loomed over me, its eyeless gaze holding me paralyzed. "You have seen the truth. You are bound to it now. The threads are in your blood, in your dreams, in the spaces between your thoughts. They will never leave you." Before I could protest or plead, the threads unraveled, scattering into the forest like ink dropped into clear water. The figure dissolved with them, leaving me alone in the clearing. The marks on my arms burned hot, then cold, and I knew they were no longer just marks. They were windows into something else, something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. I left Yukimura the next day, but the threads came with me. They're always there, in the corners of my vision, a constant reminder of what I've seen. Sometimes I wake up with new marks on my skin, winding further up my arms, my neck, creating patterns that seem meaningful in a way I can't comprehend. The villagers were right. Once you're bound, you never truly leave. The shrine owns a piece of you, a piece that grows larger with each passing day. The shrine's pull grows stronger each day. I've started dreaming of it again, feeling the threads tightening around me, pulling me back. In my more lucid moments, I wonder if I'll eventually return, becoming another offering in that ancient box. Another story whispered by villagers to warn away the curious. I don't know how much longer I can resist. If you ever hear of the Shrine of the Black Threads, stay away. Don't let academic curiosity or the promise of discovery lure you in. Some knowledge isn't worth the price, and some threads, once woven into your life, can never be unraveled. The threads are moving again. They're always moving now.